Is it working? Yes, that's just flashed up as saying it's now live. Oh, the system likes to give me a panic attack. Right, so, hello, we have people, and it looks like it's working after pressing the button about 3 times to start it. So, hope you're all having a good Tuesday. Yes. It is working. That is good. That is very good. Right, today we're talking about the War Emergency Destroyers. Basically, I theoretically have the pictures in order. So we're talking about the titchy ships, which everyone likes to forget. However, they matter quite a lot. And the first thing I want to put to sleep is the idea that the War Emergency Destroyers were War Emergency Destroyers that the Royal Navy just panicked into putting into place. I know I've kept using it in my tweets, but that's the mythology around them, that they're a panic buy. They're really not. Yes, I know, we're hoping for model railroading. There is some model railway stuff going on. It is going to be built. Probably by the time you tune in on Thursdays, there'll be trains running around in the background while I'm talking. Just act as extra distraction. So, we're talking about destroyers. We're talking about the ships which the Royal Navy always needs. Now, the interesting thing about the War Emergency Destroyers is there's technically 112 ships bought underneath that designation. Think about that. 112 ships. In the nicest way, you do not buy 112 ships, especially of the size and requirements of a destroyer, and you're building them just as an emergency, just as something which is basically, panic buy. Panic buy would have been the Flower class Corvettes. Panic buy, and even they weren't a panic buy. Escort carriers, and even they weren't as much of a panic buy. So this is what's going on. But as always, one of my favourite pictures is of course this, which is what the Royal Navy was worrying about, protecting global trade. Did anyone else lose the stream? I'm hoping the stream's working. It was playing up a bit for me earlier. So, if it's still working, good. Right. It did take me 2 times to get it to log in. So, I was going to try that position up there, but I'm wondering if that's having fun with the Wi-Fi. I don't know. Let's see. Let's move you all in closer. I do apologise. This means you're going to see more of my ugly mug. So, the Royal Navy's looking at protecting the world. It's got to build destroyers. And it's had a plan since 1935, put in by the 3rd Sea Lord at the time, of what to happen. Now, the Royal Navy was continually building destroyers. Destroyers were 2 flotillas a year, whatever the year. There was 16 to 18 destroyers being ordered pretty much every year. They had to for their needs, and this was in peacetime. So, honestly, 112 destroyers, not including the other classes which are ordered on top of that, over 5 years is only an increase of, what, 20 up to 22, so it's only an extra 3 or 4 destroyers a year. It's not a lot extra, it's what they need. And they start ordering them in October 1939. Now, why are you ordering War Emergency Destroyers in October 1939 when you have really not started to lose ships yet? Well, it's simple. The Royal Navy is planning on losing ships. It doesn't want to, but it knows it's going to. It's realistic. So, Royal Navy has a plan in place. It has Tribal class destroyers, just recently constructed. They're lovely and big, advanced, complicated to an extent, but lovely and big. It has the L class, again big, but lovely destroyers. This is HMS Lively, looking very unlively. And it has the K class, well, the J, K, and N class, if I remember correctly, which are the smaller ones, but they're perfectly versatile. Now, what do you think they would plan if they were going to build emergency destroyers? What do they base them off? Well, you're not going to base them off the big ones, because the big ones can only be built in the bigger yards. You take the K class, and that becomes the basis of the destroyers. Now, the difference between the Hunt and the Tribals, cost-wise, it depends on the yard, it depends on the Tribal, but you're looking at around about... Hunts are probably, once you're talking about mass production, 60% of a Tribal's cost. Once you're talking about it going through all design processes and actually being built and all sorts of things. But the biggest difference is in yard time and yard size. A Hunt can be churned out in about 12 months. A Tribal does take the best part of 2 years. Not to build, but to get all the stuff through. JK and Ns are very well armed for their size. Yes, they are. They are lovely and well armed for their size. But this is why the Royal Navy has them. If you look at that pattern, which was actually started by Henderson's predecessor, was you build the larger destroyers for fleet work and the smaller destroyers for convoy work. And you keep alternating each year between larger and smaller. So you always have a design ready to go of the smaller destroyers, which is ready to go and be turned into them. Now, this is where they come from. They are there. They are ready to go. This is why the Royal Navy has this design. The Royal Navy doesn't do anything to waste money. Well, they do waste money occasionally, but in this, when they're doing sort of the bigger concepts, they're trying not to waste money. They're doing it sensibly. If you have a smaller design ready to go, you can build from the smaller design. If you have a bigger design ready to go, you can build from the bigger design. They do both. Hello, Bandhold. And by the way, hello everyone. Thank you everyone for turning up today. And thank you to everyone who subscribed recently. I am now getting very, very close to 400, and I am starting to get some sort of familial bragging rights going on with my aunt, although she still doesn't think I'll make the 1,000. But, you know, nearly 400, that's pretty cool as far as I'm concerned. So, when I was doing my research, I will admit I did the academic thing. We never use Wikipedia to quote from because we don't know who's written it. That's why academics tell students not to quote from Wikipedia, because you don't know if it was me who wrote it or it was someone like Drachenfell who really, really knows their stuff, or if it was, I don't know, Robbie Williams, the singer. You don't know who wrote it. So that's why academics tell their students not to quote from it. But we tend to use Wikipedia a lot when we're hunting sources and hunting pictures, because Wikipedia, especially when it is written by people like Drachenfell and others, it is very, very well sourced. Usually you can go down to the list and you can use the sources. However, there is one article which has annoyed me on this, which is the War Emergency Program Destroyers article. So at certain points I will be referring to that article mainly to point out where it's wrong. And the first thing we're going to get into is that the Royal Navy had random guns for these ships. And this is HMS Oribe, O-class, because they failed to develop a suitable dual-purpose weapon. The Royal Navy had plans for a suitable dual-purpose weapon. They were actually working out on the 4.5-inch gun. The 4.5-inch gun that's coming into the capital ships at the time. It's supposed to be phased in. Capital ships, then into the destroyers, and it's sort of slowly coming through. That was the idea. You had the 4-inch high angle, the 4.7-inch low angle for dealing with destroyers, and these were the sort of two weapons, but they were going to be combined into 4.5-inch mount. The Royal Navy had the plan. But the plan was based on it being phased in and it turning into a system in about 1943, 1944. War comes along, you have to crash and you go with what you have. What you have is the 4.7-inch gun, which is a very good anti-ship weapon for a destroyer, and the 4-inch gun, which is a very good anti-aircraft gun for a destroyer. See the thing? They've gone on the 4.5-inch, which is halfway in between the two. Not, but it's close enough. You know, it's close enough to the heavy hitting end of the 4.7-inch. It's going to pack a punch when it hits the ship. It's far enough down that you can do high angle with it without having a lot of extra machinery. So they're going for this. Another reason they're going for this is they've picked the JKN hull. They need to keep within the JKN weight profiles and displacement profiles. And a lot of the 4.5 inches, as will be seen later, are the ones coming through initially are the ones in turrets, which are between deck turrets, which are far bigger, far heavier. The 4 inches and the 4.7 inches, they are mostly not in turrets. They are mostly in shields, in what are called mounts usually. Now, before anyone thinks the Royal Navy hates destroyer crews and they're trying to kill them, they're not. They are literally looking at them, they're using the shields because on the weight profile, you can either have a very thin metal turret, a very, very thin metal turret, where basically the metal of the turret will turn to shrapnel if it's hit by anything and shred the crew inside, or you can have a thicker piece of steel, but it only cover the stuff facing towards the enemy, hopefully, and therefore the guys have more chance of getting out the way. If there is an explosion, they won't be in the same compressive space of the explosion, and it's less likely to turn to shrapnel if it hit. That's your choice in the weight profile. So the Royal Navy's making the sensible choice on the weight profiles. Yes, Freeman does point to the 62-pounder 4.7-inch gun. There are lots of ideas for an expanded 4.7-inch. It would be very useful. And it sort of fits into why did the Royal Navy go from the 4.5-inch rather than the 5-inch. You're looking at the space that it takes to carry shells on a ship. It can carry more shells. It can be used. But also you're looking in terms of how you're going to maneuver that gun around, how you're going to load that gun, how you're going to man it. So that's your difference between the 4.7-inch, 4.5-inch and the 5-inch. It's very much how does the Royal Navy operate its ships versus how does the American Navy operate its ships. How do they feel that? Yes, the 4.5-inch was basically the Royal Navy is... I'm not getting into the Freeman one on that question on Freeman. I will discuss Freeman at some point in coming up. There's going to be a one on historians and admirals and personalities, and Freeman's going to be discussed then. But the 4.5-inch, the Royal Navy are focusing on because it works best in their profile. The Americans are interested in the 5-inch because that works best in their profile. The Royal Navy best in 4.5-inch. Because also you can pack more shells in, and that matters to the Royal Navy. Remember, they have the official number of shells they're supposed to carry, but they often have more. Now, here's the thing. Whenever I talk about the War Emergency Destroyers, and I do talk about them in my book, and I talk about them in a couple of papers, I always use the phrase, a largely homogeneous classes. Largely, because in concept they're homogeneous. They actually change in design. They start from this vessel onwards, which is HMS Quality. I've got lots of these. And by the way, anyone wants a closer look at the pictures I'm using, on my Twitter, every 4 minutes, a different picture of a destroyer is coming out. So enjoy. If you want to get blasted, just watch my Twitter feed. There are pictures coming. They're not in the same order as these are in, though, because they, for some reason, came out in alphabetical order when I was loading them up, and I didn't realise till after I'd finished putting them in. I had the idea about 40 minutes ago and quickly put them up. So, there is a difference between these two ships. The difference is the stern. These ones have a transom stern, which makes them far faster. So they're slowly evolving the ships along. And then by the time you get to this wonderful creature, Hms Tenacious, well, they've basically gone with, we still like this as a design, broadly, but it's causing us problems with seakeeping. And that seakeeping can be solved by the tribal bow. Yes, there is a reason why at a certain point in World War II, you suddenly start seeing the tribal bow becoming the very common bow shape of the Royal Navy. That's because a guy called Stanley Goodall, the chief designer of the Royal Navy, director of naval construction, and if you want proof of how important destroyers were to the Royal Navy, the guy who becomes head of naval construction for the Royal Navy is the guy who previously had been head of destroyer construction. So, he's involved in battleship design in World War One, goes out to Malta, cut for a bit, and Gibraltar, does some time on both those dockyards, comes back, takes over the destroyer section, and it's from the destroyer section he rises to becoming head of the naval construction. This guy is basically had persuaded Henderson to try a new bow type, and Henderson had gone, go for it. Then subsequent classes, conservatism had won for a bit, and then basically, after these had been in service for long enough, the Royal Navy was going, you know what, the tribal destroyers, they're really smooth and really good in the water compared to the other ships. And oh, their gun accuracy is better because of this. Oh, this might make them better at anti-aircraft fire. So, it gets adopted from, have I lost Hms Tenacious? Quite possibly. Yeah, from Tenacious onwards. Now, what you've also got to realise is the 4-inch is the better for the anti-aircraft. So, as I was saying earlier, there's a reason why some ships are produced with 4-inch guns and some ships are all 4.7-inch. In that the ones produced with 4-inch are often being used as anti-aircraft destroyers. Remember, I think last week we were discussing the C-class cruisers and their use as AA cruisers. Well, the Royal Navy had to get in some AA destroyers as well. The Royal Navy really needed to grow its anti-aircraft weaponry capability quickly. Some L-class destroyers got completed as 4-inch ships. Lots of ships suddenly came out with 4-inch weapons. It wasn't, in part, of course, it's a bit because the Royal Navy is suffering shortages and having to grow production and manufacturing very quickly. And it's going with what it's got existing already in production as a way to grow that most rapidly. But it's also in part, because, a large part, because the Royal Navy needs to grow the AA fire quickly, and that's a reliable AA weapon. How important Fleet? Fleet did feedback a lot, but to what extent? The Royal Navy definitely did prioritise seakeeping, and it prioritised the stability of the ships and their orientation. But remember, it's prioritising the seakeeping in a North Atlantic, in a South Atlantic, in the sort of very, very big, very rough oceans. If you have a ship which is primarily going to operate in the Pacific, you can afford to go with a different bow shape and emphasize different characteristics over a ship which is going to operate in the North Atlantic. The Royal Navy is always building ships to operate around the world, which means they build them to survive and work in the worst of scenarios. So where the waves are biggest, where the waves are toughest, those are the scenarios they're always aiming them for. And it works. but it does cost extra money and time in construction, something which you don't always have. Now, the Royal Navy keeps on building these ships, and they really do keep on building them. The next class to come, I've got here, is HMS Ulysses. Now, Ulysses is important because by this point, you're starting to get the really heavy AA come in, which is why I like that Andrew's question has come in straight away. Now, when they're first built, they're ordered with machine guns. They're basically, as they launch, change those machine guns to 20mm Oerlikons. By the time you're getting up to the U class, the 7th Emergency Flotilla and onwards, they're starting to look at 40mm Bofors, and they're starting to retrofit them. And remember, all these ships are using this, the fuse keeping clock, which, by the way, is another picture I've nicked off Wikipedia. As I said earlier, academics freely nick from Wikipedia. But it's the pictures and it's the references we nick. We can't use the content because we don't know who the author is. Yeah, it's annoying. You see a really good idea and you go, I cannot reference that because that's Wikipedia. I need to find out where they got that idea from. Anyway, this is how the Royal Navy was aiming. And they started really having radar being fitted from quite early on. They started having all sorts of systems fitted in from quite early on, and then they retrofitted them back to the earlier classes. The Royal Navy was very, very keen on having these ships be as capable as possible. And really, they start to reach almost their peak with the Z class. This is HMS Zambezi. By the way, that is spelt with an S, not a Z, on the Royal Navy ship. I have checked several times. Joy of dyslexia, you check. Now, Zambezi is kind of cute. And by this time, you're starting to look at the 4.5-inch gun. The Royal Navy have got that general purpose gun. This is where I have another problem with the War Emergency Program Destroyers thing on the beautiful Wikipedia. It's because they describe these vessels as utility destroyers. I wouldn't quite go utility. I would go they were what the Royal Navy needed in a basic anti-submarine, anti-air, a little bit of surface capability destroyer. But utility is going a little bit extreme. And apparently it's not until the Battle Class Destroyer of 1944 that the Royal Navy returned to building larger destroyers. The Royal Navy builds two batches of Battle Class. 1942, 1943. The 1944 batch of Battle Class get held up and converted on the stocks where they are started to be built, and in usual cases they're just paperwork, into the Daring class. Now, I'm writing a book on the Tribals, Battles and Darings, and I can honestly tell you, whilst they are great, I wouldn't say they're the only large destroyers, because the Royal Navy's built there are tribal destroyers being built throughout the war for the Royal Australian Navy and for the Royal Canadian Navy. There are the LM and LMN classes. This is a J class, which are fairly tough. And there, of course, then the Royal Navy orders the battles and then subsequently the Darings. There are large destroyers going through production, the war, pretty much the whole way through the war. So the Royal Navy always has them in production. You just don't need them as much. Yes, I'm not sure many would agree with their limited anti-surface capability. Yeah, I say limited. It's limited in comparison to what the Royal Navy would have wanted a larger destroyer to have. It's a reaction, I'm afraid, to their use of utility on this particular Wikipedia article. It's not really utility. Also, the Royal Navy like to muck around. Oh yes. In fact, the Mark 6 would have been on the 4.5s would have been on the War Emergency Destroyers. They were actually planned for the weapon class, but they weren't being fitted because of delays. So the weapons were the successors, were the next generation of intermediate destroyer. That's what the Royal Navy actually technically considers the War Emergency Destroyers, intermediate destroyers. The Hunts are the baby destroyers. Then there's the intermediate destroyers, and then there's the large fleet destroyers, fighting destroyers, depending on what you're talking about. Abdeel class, I would definitely go with them being light cruisers. The Abdeel class are definitely light cruisers because, frankly, the Royal Navy uses them as such. They, you know, yes, USN might have considered them destroyers, but nah, they were light cruisers. So, this is my favourite, though, of the War Emergency class destroyers. Please do look at her. She's called HMS Savage. And if you're looking at her and thinking, that's a funny gun on her front, that's because she has the same double gun on her front as was fitted on the battle class, the double 4.5 inch. Now, here is where I have a fun time with a lot of my fellow historians. As you will have known from watching previous videos, I am the son of a naval architect. I've looked at HMS Savage's plans, which are very helpfully in one of the great books. I got it. Ah, yes. By John Roberts. Love these books. They're amazing. Now, I go into the archives and get out the full copies of these, but this is useful because sometimes when archives try and tell me that they don't have a particular plan, I can quote his code at them and go, but he says you have it. And then they have to go digging out for me. Anyway, so, HMS Savage. There are at least 4 or 5 historians I could point to who claim that this magic gun is fitted at the front and there are no changes done internally. Now, here's the thing. The reason why she's a 4.5 inch, this turret is called a BD weapon, rather than a light, is because it's between decks. The gun, the turret system, everything, goes down about 2 decks below her. Now, it does also on the Mark 6 a little bit, but the Mark 6 is different. It's less intrusive. This has major systems down the whole way down the trunking. You have to redesign the hull, or rather the contents of the hull, to fit it. So HMS Savage is not a standard war emergency destroyer. And you find lots of them are played around this one. This is one of the interesting things. When people tell me the Royal Navy was really short, they were really worrying the whole way through the war. They were panicking through the war. That's why the war emergency destroyers are built. The amount of times they muck around with them and use them for experiments and testing, stuff which would delay them, it's beyond belief. So in nicest way, yes, they did want them. And by the way, HMS Savage gets involved in quite a lot of fighting and she lives up to her name. And this space where they couldn't fit a second gun because the weight of this mount was sufficient that they couldn't fit a single mount up there and keep her profile the same, tended to get festooned with light weapons as soon as they could. An AA mount. So she was a very, very potent tool, and she did the Arctic convoys. So she was running the high-risk routes. So the Royal Navy built her as an experiment in a way, and then she gets used a lot. The Royal Navy were not really planning to requisition or buy. They did some foreign destroyers being built for foreign navies in the British yards did get called up. The I-class most famously. The I-class turned out really, really useful. But mainly they're looking at the Town class. They're treated as basically extensions of the Hunts. When they're purchasing them in, they're going, that's great. That's a shoot forwards in the Hunt numbers. There's also the H-class. Well, no, the H-class, G-class, and then there's the I-class. I think it's the I-class. Sorry, they are all so many different names. I get fun times. Can I say something about gun direction? Yes, I will be getting into gun direction. I already... let me find a piece of paper. I have it sitting around here somewhere. I have put down, there it is. Now, fuse keeping clock. Batch 2 H class for Brazil. Yes, they became the I class, I seem to remember. Preceded by Trevor. I-class were some of the I-class had been ordered for the Turkish Navy, and they were instead taken into the Royal Navy. And there were some H-class again for Brazil. It's fun times. They did take them up. Right, so gun direction. How does the system work? Well, the Royal Navy has something called the fuse keeping clock. You have a director unit up here, and as the war goes on, this gets fitted with a radar, usually type 295 from memory. Let me just show, 285. 295 is a radar fitted to a bigger class of destroyer. Sorry. 285 on the most destroyers. And... or is that 293? 293 is what's fitted on the bigger destroyers. Sorry. Brain dying. Just humour me in my old age. And that information is passed down to this area, which on this thing is labelled the gunnery calculation position. It's where the fuse keeping clock, it's where they start to measure all the tachymetric data. They try and put everything together, and they try and come up with a firing profile, and then from there it goes up and back here, and that's used to direct the guns. The Royal Navy's gun system is pretty much designed, yes. And at some point, someone is going to explain to me why the Royal Navy has to have so many numbers that sound exactly the same for their radars in World War II. Thank you, Force 819. I was getting Type 293, Type 295, and Type 285, and probably Type 282, all mixed up in my head at the time. Should really do even more notes on this stuff. So, what is this purpose for? What does it do? What data does it do? Okay. The Type 285 is the radar we need to worry about with the Royal Navy and its firing directions. Type 285 radar tended to be fitted up to provide information directly to the directors, but they also still kept all the visual systems they had, so they could back up things. And this was important because radars like to go wrong, especially in World War II. I always found... yeah, don't get me started on the Type 274. I was writing that in the book. I will just go into a little side, and I actually went and checked that 6 times because I just wrote in the Type 283, Type 285. Who cares about the enemy? It's confusing me. But the direction does work on quite a lot of them. And it's all designed to give them as much information as they can come in. But remember, the guns also always keep their own individual control. And everything is done in the Royal Navy in a way that can back up. So that if bits go down, the rest can keep working. And this is critical because on average are going through a radar, i.e. their radar getting busted every 6 to whether it's true or not. And it was one of the junior controllers trying to put in for more money. I hope I'm not cutting out too much. Chaffers and Bray cutting out. Huge. Hopefully, still working. I've still got full Wi-Fi, and it says it's working as far as it's telling me. So, this is HMS Caesar. Now, these are the later on ones, and if anyone's ever been to see HMS Cavalier, that is something you want to do. Not receiving suturing. As such, viewers will experience buffering. Yeah, I've just had a note come up saying that YouTube isn't receiving enough video to maintain smooth streaming. As such, viewers will experience buffering. I do apologize. I'm not sure why it's doing that. It's exactly the same as I've had the system working before. So I will cross fingers on it. And I apologize. But HMS Caesar, rather cute, is the 4.5-inch armed, and it's the C-class. They are, anyways, the final wartime war emergency flotillas. Yes, there's the weapon class which comes after. Yes, but these are the war emergency class reaching their final thing. And the thing I want to point out with them is how different they look to, if I can find it. No, not that one. Not that one. It's always going to be the last one I find, isn't it? Ah, it's now saying it's working properly. Yes. So, look at these two and see how different they look. This is the basis of them. As time goes on, because of the increased demands for more stable weaponry, for radars, for all these things, the ships grow. And by the end, you end up not only with definitely the bow of the tribal, and still the tribal bow, but you end up with largely the hull of the J class and the L class to an extent, sitting there. This is a combined ship, and it's grown. It's still considered the intermediate destroyer, but it's grown in size to what was the big destroyer of prior to World War II. Now, how do the 54 Pipers fit in the Iron Destroyer plans? They basically fit in as extra hunts. That's pretty much what the Royal Navy was planning on using them for. Now, that is the problem. When the war emergency cruisers and destroyers start out, you've got the O class, which go from being laid down in July 1940. They will be completed in service by October 1941, which is critical. By the time you're getting onto these big boys, they are taking longer. They're nearly 2 years again. And they have to be, because they have to be to take the stuff they're going to require to carry. And they actually get more complicated as time goes on. Hence, HMS Comet. Yes, I do love the fact the Royal Navy had a destroyer named after a fiery ball of stone. Well, you know, water, gas, frozen stuff. HMS Comet. And the thing is, they're bigger. These are also bigger. These are the battle class. These are what are being built as the big destroyers by the end of World War II. And you need all of them, because you still have to fight the same way around the world. They take longer to enter service. They're bigger. All these things. They're also more complicated. One of the interesting things is that as the war goes on, the Royal Navy is prefabricating more and more parts of the destroyers. It is welding more and more of its destroyers. In fact, they're becoming all welded ships during the production of the war emergency destroyers and all sorts of things. Principally to speed up production, principally to make them faster. But they're having constant trouble getting it in. And one of the quotes I like to use when I'm discussing this with students is one from actually Stanley Goodall. And luckily, I have just used it in my book, and it is sitting in front of me. So I can get it. One important matter in planning, a word that has become rather unpopular of late, is the psychology of the people called upon to carry out the plans. We have heard a great deal about the prefabricated ships in the United States. There the shipyard labour was new and had to be trained so that the methods adapted were readily accepted. But in our case, the prefabricated parts were assembled by men used to normal practice. They may vote progressive in elections, but they are conservative in their work. It was very trying after all our efforts to see work absolutely stopped because two unions could not agree which should put together the prefabricated parts to make a fair ship. Eventually that difficulty was overcome, but we lost some valuable time. In answer to question, Will, that is also the answer to your question. That quote. Stanley Goodall and whichever third Sea Lord at the time spent a huge amount of World War II keep going backwards and forwards to yards dealing with unions who were going, but we've always built it this way. And it wasn't because they were anti-war effort. Please don't think that. It was because they were looking at the way it was changing and technology was changing so rapidly. They wanted often to do the best they could, but they also wanted a fair price for what they were getting. And the trouble is they thought that the new work, A, cut out their money, and B, made an issue. It caused trouble. It caused strenuous issues. It caused things to have to be pulled together quite rapidly. But this delayed a lot of ships. And this was actually, Stanley Goodall spoke this after the Second World War. It was in a meeting at the Institution of Naval Architects. Also, though, another reason you keep riveting is because, as he said, the shipyard labour was experienced. The British had a lot of shipyard labour which was used to riveting. So you could either stop, or you could either accept that the ships might take a day or two longer to build and be slightly heavier, or you could stop production in a yard for maybe a month or so and change them over to welding. The practice was, of course, to do a sort of half and half approach, because you didn't want to stop any yards and you didn't want to keep on losing time riveting. So you slowly transitioned people across to welding. You slowly took people out and trained them in welding and then had them go back. And actually here the Royal Navy had an advantage. And it was a big advantage over pretty much anyone. The Royal Navy had been investing in welding since 1916. The Royal Navy had been investing in developing these techniques, in doing all these things going on. And when I say Royal Navy in 1916, there is an issue. It's not actually the Navy doing the research, but actually a group of officers take money, because they are actually quite rich officers even outside naval service, and can afford this, and actually invest and sponsor some very discerning gentlemen of industrial academic type to do some research into the art of welding. And that's the thing. The Royal Navy's pushing it forward, and that's why these things come on. So, open bridges. That's always a good question. Why did the Royal Navy keep open bridges? Well, if it's pre-radar, how the best do you provide yourselves with good view around? You're using your eyes. If it's pre-radar, even post-radar, radar coming in, how much of that information is coming back? How much of that information is available? You need to be able to see what's going on around you, especially if you're a destroyer, especially if you're involved in night fighting or in the dirty, close-in fighting destroyers get involved. You need to be able to fix your targets. You need to be able to see aircraft. An open bridge becomes very sensible in those circumstances. Plus, it saves weight. And it matters. When we're talking about building a 4,000-5,000 ton ship, then a few extra tons on higher up in terms of its displacement. So that would move its weight profile higher up, its center of mass higher in the ship. That's probably not going to matter because there's going to be a huge, great big weight down below. But when you're dealing with ships less than 2,000 tons, you have to start being really careful about top weight, about that center of mass, because otherwise you have to ballast for it. And that can ruin your profile through the water. So you really need to be careful with these things and what they're doing. In fact, a good example of ships which had a lot of trouble with it. Sorry to disappear for a second. Are these. The Castle-class corvettes. They have tremendous trouble the whole way through the war with top weight because people keep adding stuff on the top of them. Often Navy that are progressive guys when it comes to new ideas over arms. Well, in navies tend to have to be progressive. They tend to be A, stuck on ships with people moaning at each other, and B, if they don't embrace technology, they tend to get written over by technology. So navies tend to push it. Welding does save weight. That is another advantage. But That's why the Royal Navy was pushing welding so much in the interwar years, because it allowed them to save a lot of weight. And it managed to get them to do a lot of stuff. Carriers are a good example of this. Yes, Will, that is actually probably the bigger loss. Also, it's going to sound strange, but the Royal Navy was in many ways clean on the open bridges because they helped them have a lot of use. Yes, Seagull's launched in 1957 is the first all-welded ship, but they actually have trouble with her hull at points. But they do manage to keep going and do scale it up. And Seagull was pushed forward by one of those officers who was involved in putting forward the welding in the first place. And it goes back to my favourite mantra at the moment, it seems to be, I keep talking about him, is, of course, the third Sea Lord in 1937, Admiral Henderson. Yeah. I know, I keep talking about him. I've got to stop. Or I'm going to sound like a one-track pony. That is the other problem. When it comes to repairing battle damage, riveting is actually easier because, again, there is riveting going on all around the world. Welding is something which is not in place. So often you find ships when they return from Alexandria or the Far Eastern areas where they've had to be repaired emergency, they'll have welded components put into them because, well, not welded, they'll have riveted components put into them because rivets are what they can do in that area. They don't have the welding technology. Welding is high tech. This is something we have to think about. In the 1930s, welding is high tech. Why did the... Now, it's to do with the breech shape, actually. The 4.7-inch guns could, in theory, have been turned into true dual-purpose weapons. But to do so, you would have had to reshape the mount and the breech. You basically have had to rebuild a gun. So they were doing that. They had isolated this problem in the 1930s, and they're going to have to... They did the 4.5-inch gun. That's what they were doing. They'd taken the 4.7-inch, they'd made the breech all slightly smaller, 4.5-inch came through, and they had developed this dual-purpose gun. That's what they'd done. You're going to have to start selling Henderson merch. Yes, I am. Will. 8 nights, first time view. That's good. I'm thanking Harry that you're enjoying it so much. It is a really strange scenario when you're dealing with those guns because it can get very complicated very quickly. But basically, the Royal Navy is looking at its destroyers primarily as torpedo ships. Okay? Up until about 1934, torpedoes are the big thing for destroyers. Then you have the tribal class being conceived, and they start thinking about guns. Now, anti-submarine capability is always something which is part of them, Andrew. It is tagged on, but it's mainly its terms of depth charges originally. And then as the war goes on, of course, you get development of the squid mortar and all the other air-saving mortars, which again causes more fun in their design. And it causes the ships to grow because guess what? The amount of effect and straining on a hull of a mortar firing versus depth charges firing is very different. And you need more. So this causes the ships to grow. Also, one of the interesting, and this may be completely mythical because I've never found any proof of it, but one of the first test firings of a squid mortar, one of the mortars actually managed to hit the radar. Hey ho. And so the mortar blew up the radar on the destroyer, and it both had to fix, and things had to be fixed. They did a lot of work, and I doubt that really happened, but it could well have been a dummy round hit the radar, and that is where the story comes from. So they had to develop all these things as they were going on. They had to build the ships up as they were going on. World War II is a time of this transition. Again, if we go back to it, the Royal Navy in the 1930s is looking at 1942, 1943, the 4.5-inch gun will have come in. They were expecting to have to go back and rebuild ships which were already in service and convert them from 4.7 to 4.5 inch. They had these plans stretching out to about 1948, 1949 is being discussed. So the Royal Navy has this idea in place. They are using depth charges. They have torpedoes. They want to change quadruple torpedo mounts to quintuple torpedo mounts because they actually want to hit more things. And please note, there are two ways of sinking a ship, okay? There are many people who claim there are others, but there are only two ways. One, you create a hole where water's coming in and it can't be blocked. And two, you create a fire which can't be put out. Either of those ways are the ways you sink ships. Anything else is just how you cause that. Now, torpedoes stay in fashion till well after World War II. You've got the Daring class come in after World War II. They're carrying 2 quintuple torpedo sets. A lot of them are carrying our torpedoes. A lot of them are involved. Because the missiles don't come in for... Well, it's first the missiles are surface-to-air missiles. They're not really anti-ship weapons, and it takes a while for them to develop up the anti-ship weapons, for them to develop up these things. So it comes back again to what are the destroyers being used for? What are the ships being used for? So torpedoes are present throughout them designs, and they slowly become quintuple. And you have the guns change. You have the AA armament changes. AA goes from machine guns to 20mm Oricons to 40mm Bofors. The weights change. You suddenly have tachymetric Stag mounts coming in and Hazelmeyers and all sorts of things designed to provide more firepower. Yes, they did. Some of them did. I think some of them lost them, but some of them did keep their torpedoes till 1973 because torpedoes are useful. They will make a guaranteed big hole in a ship. In fact, I remember one of the early reports on the Sveldov class, which was written about it, was that it didn't matter if the Royal Navy firepower in terms of guns or their cruisers couldn't match up the Sveldovs. They carried big torpedoes. And that was literally the report. I'm not sure whether it would work out long term, but it was certainly the idea. Because again, you make a big hole in a ship, it's going to sink. And actually, one of the things I've been surprised at over the years is that not more effort has been made into turning things like ASROC and SUBROC into anti-ship weapons. Because if they were a bigger torpedo on a rocket and you were firing those into an enemy task group, there'd be a lot of problems going on. But also probably scared the living daylights out of many submarine captains to have that bigger torpedo coming on their way. What is the comparable AA hit rate of 4.5, 4.7 versus Bofors? Okay, they're used for different things. The Bofors tends to be aimed at the target to try and shoot it out of the air. The 4.5, 4.7 tend to be used to try and create sort of areas of barrage, areas where the aircraft don't want to go, shrapnel fields, these sort of things to stop them going through. Sea Slug did have theoretical anti-surface capability, but it's mainly a surface-to-air weapon, and honestly, the Sea Slug AS anti-surface ability is a little bit overworrying. There are... Okay, so... Destroyers, because of their size, were always going to be multi-role. In fact, warships are always going to be multi-role. It's whether a role is emphasized over another. So if you're looking at the War Emergency Destroyers, you can say they emphasize their torpedoes, they emphasize their anti-aircraft weapons, they, to an extent, emphasize their anti-submarine weapons. That's what they're emphasizing. When you're looking at the battle class, the tribal class, you can say they emphasize their anti-surface weapons, which again are their torpedoes and their guns. These things have emphases, but they're always general purpose systems because they carry so many weapons. You don't have the opportunity to basically go, right then, I want to build a warship which will just take on submarines, because the odds are it will sail out into the ocean and come straight across an enemy cruiser and suddenly not be able to do anything. So you have to build them all as multi-purpose, as general purpose. The Americans operate the 5-inch for everything because that's what they're building. The Royal Navy operate the Royal Navy choose the 4.5 inch because that's what they've made the choice of prior to World War II. And then after World War II, they do studies. And they decide that the difference between the 5 inch and 4.5 inch is not enough to warrant the expense of going through all the transitions. And also the 4.5 inch works for the Royal Navy. It works in terms of being able to carry more shells, more rounds on a slightly smaller ship. The Americans tend to build slightly bigger ships. The Royal Navy tends to build slightly smaller, slightly more dense ships. It's a different approach to how to make them survivable. And therefore, the Royal Navy wants to be able to pack as many shells in their ship as the Americans can pack in theirs. And the difference between a 4.5 and a 5 inch in terms of what the Royal Navy feels isn't that great. So therefore, they use them that way. Subrock and Azeroth did have anti-ship capabilities. Yes, they did, especially when they had the nuclear depth charges, but they weren't really emphasized. They were anti-submarine weapons far more than they were anti-ship weapons. What I'm talking about is I've always been surprised the primary anti-ship weapon isn't developed, which is a missile launching a torpedo. Especially in these days when we're talking about missiles which shoot out multiple warheads and these sort of things. I'm surprised one of those multiple warheads is not a torpedo, drops into the water, and 2 fire on or something like that. Just something which would make sense, because to make the profile problem for the ship even more. Yes, the Americans have multiple 5 inches as well, which is another issue for the Royal Navy when they try to use the Mark 37 control system, because the Mark 37, it comes in different variants and it's setting up for different variants, and which one do you order, which one best fits the profile of the 4.5 inch. Type 26 and Type 31 could well be fitted with 5 inch. Times have changed. Type 45 has been designed to be taking 5 inch. Britain is one of the few Western naval powers which is still focusing on the 4.5 inch. It makes sense to standardise across NATO and with our allies on a 5 inch. So that might well be something we're going to do. 5 inch was... no. The RN jump around a lot longer because the RN jump around in terms of their weapon caliber because they are looking for what best suits them. And that's the important thing. What suits them is going to be the 4.5 inch. And the reason that suits them is also it builds off a lot of the 4.7 inch ammunition. You've got a lot of factories, a lot of things which can churn out the 4.7 or churn out the 4 inch. They can easily be made to churn out the 4.5. You can retrofit a lot of factory equipment. So again, it's something sensible for the Royal Navy in that period. Yeah, the Z weapons are something I've been looking at and have got those similar capabilities to what I've been talking about. Have to log off, Sal, and take care, Sal. Thank you for coming. Right then, so I am looking at the time. Any questions? Have you all had an interesting time? Because I have, but I like talking about this stuff. I like talking about Royal Navy destroyers in World War II. They're cool. Okay, the vulnerability zone for most ships. The vulnerability zone for a ship will be its areas where it can't concentrate its guns, and some of them are quite heavily dependent upon where it can't defend itself. So, if you're building a ship, and let's say you're talking about a tribal destroyer, it will has 2 turrets either end. Both have pretty much 270 degrees. All the systems have 270 degrees of fire, so therefore they have full coverage. When you start building a battle class destroyer, though, and its big guns are all at the front, it's got them mounted as far forward as possible, so they can each have about 300 degrees of fire, because there is actually a space at the stern, so they're vulnerable. I'm glad. So basically, the zone of a threat for a ship depends on the ship and its layout of its own weapons. I'm glad you all had a good time. And was there considering going to tribals? Yes, there was. But honestly, the main problem when they looked at replacing, keeping the tribals post World War II was their engines. They had killed them during World War II. On average, the tribals spent more of World War II cruising at 30 knots than any other class of destroyer in the Royal Navy. And by the end of World War II, they were looking at entirely new engines. They would have needed to take the whole ships apart and replace their engine gearing. They'd done that much damage to them. So that, combined with their ongoing turbinitis, because they had early forms of turbines which had issues, meant that they were not retained. Yes, there'll be trains as well as the naval stuff on Thursday. And again, can you please do me a favour and share and tweet out and do all those things and subscribe, because as many of you know, I am competing for bragging rights with my aunt in that she reckons I can't get a lot of people to be subscribing and can't reach 1,000, and I'm now hopeful, because I've reached nearly 400 thanks to all you, that I might be able to do it and might be able to get the familial bragging rights. Were there any of the wartime destroyers that got retrofitted to have helicopters? Yes, some were retrofitted to have helicopters, but not in the sense of getting hangars often. They had landing stations put in and all sorts of things, and some had big radars put on post-war and were turned into radar pickets. Basically, as time goes on, when you want to fit these things, you need to do a lot of changes to a ship. And at a certain point, when you're going to be changing the weight profile and the top weight profile and displacement profile that much, it's cheaper to build a new ship than it is to try and retrofit a hull. Now, unfortunately, my aunt doesn't stream about anything. Otherwise, I would be sending you to her. I have suggested that she does ballroom dancing, which is her love and her passion, but no, she doesn't want to do that. The 4-inch, actually, the 4-inch is heavily produced, yes, but the 4.7-inch comes in about the same. They're being produced in about the same numbers. And that's another reason why the Royal Navy is keeping both, and why they want to focus in on the 4.5-inch as this system which can go for both, because you can replace both manufacturing with one gun. So that's part of the Royal Navy's emphasis and aiming for the 4.5-inch. Anyway. It's now past 7 o'clock, and I hope you've all had a good time, and I'm going to log off. I will answer any questions which come through on Twitter, and this will be posted as a video, as it normally is, and hopefully see you next Thursday, which, if I get up quickly, I'm fairly sure is the Royal Navy's plans for global war, but let me just check. That's May, and yes. The Thursday 16th, RN's plans for simultaneous war. Take care and have a nice week. See you Thursday.